Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 16, and we're very pleased to bring you a change to our published schedule because today Paul and I are delighted to welcome to the podcast Shrabani Basu, author of The Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer, a new and groundbreaking book on the case of George Edalji. Shrabani is a journalist and Sunday Times best-selling author. Her books include the critically acclaimed For King and Another Country, Indian Soldiers on the Western Front, Victoria and Abdul, the true story of the Queen's closest confidant, which you'll remember was turned into an excellent Oscar-nominated motion picture, Spy Princess, the life of Noor Inayat Khan, and Curry, the story of the nation's favourite dish. She's the founder and chair of the Noor Inayat Khan Memorial Trust, which successfully campaigned for a memorial for the World War II heroine, which was unveiled in London in 2012, and she's a frequent commentator on radio and television on Indian history and empire. Shrabani, welcome to the podcast.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Mark.
Now, there's so much to cover. Paul and I have got so many questions, so let's get stuck in and maybe let's begin with the book. So for those who haven't got their copy yet, can you tell us a bit about what the Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer is all about?
George Edalji was a lawyer, and he is the son of a vicar. The vicar's name was Shapurji Edalji, and Shapurji had come from India. He was a Parsee, he had converted to Christianity, and he had become the vicar of Great Wyrley. So here was this brown man preaching the word of Christ to a completely white parish. And, so he has married an English woman. They have 3 children. The children, are called half caste. And of course, it's something that's just going to, it's not going to go down well in this village. It's a very insular, it's a small mining village. You have either the working class miners or you have the aristocrats. And it's, this family is going to just fall through both sides. And so that is the start of the story. I mean, the story starts in Victorian England. It starts in 1876 when Shapurji Edalji actually becomes the vicar of Great Wyrley. And he's the first South Asian vicar in England. And George is born within a few months. So George is their firstborn. And by the time George is just 12, these messages, hate-filled messages, letters, poison pen letters, graffiti, all start. So one day the vicar finds that outside the vicarage, it's painted, the Edaljis are wicked. And he wipes it off, gets on with it. And then these letters start. And they are vicious. They are violent almost. And they are racist. There is no other way of describing them. And so this is the start, and the children are just young. George is just 12 and he's being targeted. So they don't know what to do. There's nobody to help them. They go to the police. The police are not helpful. In fact, the police think that it's George who's written these letters. So for some reason, George is suspect. But so to come back to your question, and then of course it gets more and more serious because in 1903, when there is actually a crime in the village, the police think it's George who's done it and he is arrested. And that's how this whole story starts, because George is then arrested, imprisoned, tried, and imprisoned for 7 years. And he then writes to Arthur Conan Doyle to help him clear his name, which is how Arthur Conan Doyle comes into the picture.
How did you first hear about the Edalji case? And then how did you then find out about this archive that Portsmouth Museum have got, which have led you into the new information about the case.
Right. So, Paul, I love doing stories about these unknown characters who played a role in history, and most of my books are based on those. So, I'm always looking for interesting characters, Asian characters, Indians with who have a link to British history as well. So, Victoria and Abdul, nobody knew about this story about Abdul Karim and Queen Victoria. It's so I'm always digging around. I'm a journalist by profession. I love bringing out these stories. So I did know about George Edalji because he's obviously, I'm also a huge fan of Arthur Conan Doyle. So I had
Yes.
read certain, biographies of his. So I knew that the only case that Arthur Conan Doyle investigates himself was to do with an Indian. It was like, goodness, this is a story I have to follow. This is a link that is just terrific. So I always had it in mind, but I was working on other books and, the day job and everything else. And then Julian Barnes published a book. And I said, oh dear, he's beaten me to it. And he's Julian Barnes. And who am I? So that was that. And then I said, okay, we'll rest this. And I sort of put it on the back burner and went on with my other books. And then in 2015, bit of luck. I saw a small article in the newspaper saying that there was going to be an auction of some letters of Arthur Conan Doyle, and they were to the chief of Staffordshire Police, and they dealt with the Edalji case. And it was like, okay, this is it. Over my cereal, I said, oh, I've got to follow this up. This is a sign. And that's what really started me off. I made an appointment. I went there to Bonham's, the auction house. And I was wearing my journalist hat because I had to sneak in there, get in there, which is true. I mean, I did write an article about it. So I wasn't, kidding them, but I wanted to see all the papers. And they were really surprised that a journalist wanted to sit there for 3 hours looking at these papers. They said, you're just writing an article. And I just couldn't be torn away from those boxes because there was so much there. Then anyway, finally I let them go. And I said, I prayed that it would not go into a private collection and I wouldn't be able to see them. Because believe me, there were so many boxes and I knew it was full of, really good unpublished material. So luckily, Portsmouth Library bought. They have the Arthur Conan Doyle archives, so they bought the material. And as soon as I heard about them, I heard about this. I made an appointment, and I think I was the first in there to read those
Yes.
boxes, get through them. And they were just amazing because, there was my story. It was just so much happening, which, we'll discuss later. But that was the start of it, really.
I mean, you must have been on absolute tenterhooks, worrying that this was going to cross to America or somewhere else and just disappear from public view completely.
I was, I honestly, I'm not the praying sort, and I prayed that, oh, please, please don't let these go to a private collector, because even though private collections, they let you access it, it just makes it that much more difficult, isn't it? And then you have to write
Yes,
to
yeah.
the person and whether they want to let you access it also. So anyway, I was lucky.
Absolutely.
Good old Portsmouth archives, they bought them. Yeah.
The Anson papers are the major new revelation in the book, but taking a step back just before we go into Anson in a bit more detail, let's focus a bit more on the Edaljis themselves as well. And one thing that really struck me in the book that I think hasn't come out of previous accounts in quite the same way was the sheer level of hostility and harassment and intimidation that the Edalji family suffered. I mean, that was quite incredible.
So these poison pen letters are actually in the National Archives, and some of them are in Portsmouth. And to sit there in the archives and look at these letters, some of them are torn, some of them are just little shreds of paper with crude drawings on them, some of them are longer and vicious and underlined. And, you have words like revenge written on them, and George will be in his grave. And yeah, it's just a thought that, this vicar is receiving these and knowing that his child, his son, is being threatened every day, and it must have been horrible for them. But these archives, so you can see these letters in the archives. And then of course, there are more records in Birmingham archives and Staffordshire archives. So I traveled between different archives and had to put the whole story together. The Home Office files are in the National Archives, so that's where you get a lot of the police records and the trial and everything else.
Well, I think it's amazing that you managed to pull together so much material on the early life of George and the background on Shapurji, and that is a major aspect of the book. It's something that really has, I think, moved forward the scholarly study of this topic, because that was really just a footnote in previous works. And as you say, Shapurji comes out as quite an amazing character. I wonder what you thought of Shapurji staying in the village, because if you put yourself in that circumstance, I mean, I'm not sure I would be able to resist those
Yeah.
sort of pressures on myself and the family.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking, what is this man going through with nobody to help him? But it also reminded me of, in the early 70s and 60s and 70s, it's what the immigrants went through, all the
Yeah.
South Asian immigrants. If you think of the Bangladeshi who ran all these curry houses, the people would come in and, hit them on the head, be rude, offensive. You think of all the Asian news agents, and they would have graffiti on them, and they'd all come in around the 70s. They owned the corner shops. They would have their windows broken. They would be vandalized. They would have graffiti. What would they do? They would just repair the window, wash off the graffiti, and get on with it. And I think this is the sort of spirit that Shapurji had. He just carried on. He did what he thought he should do. So he went to the police, got nowhere with them. He also went to the media. So he tried his best. He knew that the media, it would be reported. So he went to journalists. He went to the media. He did get coverage, but it didn't really help him either. Uh, what puzzles me is why he didn't go appeal to all the vicars in neighboring churches. Why didn't the
Yeah.
church stand up to help this man who is being so oppressed, and he's writing about it in the paper? So that puzzles me. Maybe he was just proud. Maybe he didn't think about it. Who knows? He just went to the police, went to the press, and took it that way.
I mean, you talk in the book about Shapurji with his marriage, that through his marriage he was actually very well connected into the higher echelons of the Church of England, and it is very strange how they don't step in to defend their man.
That's true.
It is
That's
definitely
true.
one of the oddities of the case.
It is, but also on the other hand, he did get his job as the vicar of Great Wyrley because of connections. So maybe there was also resentment
Yes.
because this was literally handed to him. It was handed to him as a gift by Charlotte's uncle, who was retiring from the position, and he had the gift of the curacy. He gave it to his niece's husband, and Shapurji is installed. So maybe that led to some sort of discontent and resentment. Who knows what was really sort
Yes.
of boiling, but a lot of elements were boiling over there. And Shapurji, well, the church didn't stand by Shapurji, that's for sure. He served as the vicar for 40 years. He's buried in the same church. So it's incredible what he went through and how he never gave up the fight. He carried on. And he carried on with his work as a vicar as well at the same
Yes.
time. So it's quite a character.
The other thing that really comes out of the book, and I think it's something I really, really enjoyed, was the fact that you had brought out so much agency in the Edalji family as well. So they, in previous accounts I can think of, they are presented very much as victims and powerless victims. But as you've just described with Shapurji is actively doing things to try to help. And George is no slouch in this respect either. I mean, George is very active, and I really enjoyed the fact that you were able to bring out that side. They came off the page as very real people.
Well, it was important for me to enter this vicarage and see, feel what they're going through and see their fight, because you're right. I mean, they really put up a fight. So Shapurji, his son is in jail. He is so upset. He left his country and he believed he was coming to a civilized place, and he's been let down, but he carries on. He at his services, Sunday services, he starts a petition, so he goes into it straight away. And at this stage, I must say, his wife is really supportive. So Charlotte also, I think she puts up a really good fight too. She writes letters to all these legal experts who have started questioning whether there was a miscarriage of justice. And she writes, her sister writes, so the family. Charlotte is there, Shapurji is there. They're a team, literally a core team. It's like the Edalji campaign, which they are running, and they do it very well because they manage to get 10,000 signatures for a petition to give to the Home Office, and he doesn't give up. And George carries on from prison, and he keeps writing that this is unfair, and he keeps pointing out all the things that went wrong in the trial, but of course nobody's listening.
No.
And then Brainwave, he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, who has this shy solicitor who had no friends, he's a loner, to think that he would pick up the pen and think of writing to the most famous writer of the day and say, help me. And that famous writer would say, yes, I will. I mean, it's incredible. And then they become friends because Arthur Conan Doyle really takes a liking to George, sees him for that he's genuine, sees the plight of the family. And so I think that story of their friendship is also really nice as well.
Yes, it is. And George attended his second wedding.
Exactly.
There's quite a lot of myth making in Conan Doyle's life. And one of the things I found interesting in your book was that Shapurji and I think it maybe George as well had made the point about George's eyesight, which is probably if there's one thing the Conan Doyle aficionados will know about the case, it's that when Conan Doyle first met George, he said he couldn't do it because I can see, he's got poor eyesight. But actually that was already in the public domain, as it were, wasn't it? Because Shapurji had already been campaigning on this point.
He had, and George had written to the Home Office, and he'd written to his family that please get my eye test done. And Shapurji says that he wanted the results of the tests that were done, and they were not given to him. And he makes a speech saying this, and there's lots of shames from the audience that listen to him. So yes, it is, but it is the thing is that it was also written about before. George himself wrote about it in the Umpire magazine. But, you have George writing about it, and you have Arthur Conan Doyle, really fleshing this out. It's a world of difference. So the minute Conan Doyle comes into the picture, and this is splashed across the Daily Telegraph, 2 days, all 8 columns, and carried across the pond. It's carried in the Washington Times, New York Times. It's carried all over the UK. It is sensational. In Conan Doyle's own words, he said, I think England was ringing with the rights of George Edalji, or, something to that effect. So it is absolutely sensational. George is suddenly famous. Everybody knows him. And he is, and the media crucially changes its tune.
Yes.
You get a bit of celebrity stardust, and suddenly, the very things that they had reported about his oriental appearance, his debased jaw, his eyes, everything, suddenly it's, these were the reasons. The whole narrative changes. It's incredible. I read a lot of newspaper reports because I think they really give you the pulse of what is going on. And I could just see, oh my goodness, you've changed your tune here. Because, ACDs come into the picture. You are now saying, oh, this man was victimized because of his color. And, your earlier reports were saying he's debased. It's very clear this Oriental did it because they sacrifice animals in the dark, etc. So, it was good to see that how how the media changed its tune. And so the effect that Conan Doyle has is immediate, and it is huge.
It's interesting as well that sort of perspective is the way the media were writing all these tropes that they're using about George Edalji and the Orientalism and so on. That a lot of this is actually taken from, or the sort of wording is taken from popular literature. and the sort of books that later characters like Sax Roma and so on will be writing. And Conan Doyle himself, in his
Exactly.
earlier career, writes a little bit along these sort of lines with early stories like Uncle Jeremy's Household, The Mystery of Clumber, and The Sign of Four,
Yeah,
where we do have
absolutely.
these sort of racial tropes
Mm-hmm.
and stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was certainly not as strong on this as an awful lot of the writers. I mean, if you compare him to somebody like Sapper,
Mm-hmm.
he's not in their league at this at
Mm-hmm.
all. But
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, he's written this kind of stuff, and it's very interesting and rather nice to then have him step in
Mm-hmm.
to this case
Yeah.
and really turn this on its head
Yeah,
and turn
absolutely.
the attitudes of the newspapers and through them the public on their heads about
Mm-hmm.
this whole issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very timely story as well, of course, for the world that we're living in now. It's hugely relevant.
Of course. And I mean, I think the reason that, you're so right that Arthur Conan Doyle himself had these stereotypes. I mean, India to him was like either they're bandits or they're thuggies, or it's like festering with, as British writers were obsessed with the mutiny. So it's like the rebels and the bandits and the thuggies. And of course, he got everything all wrong. He got all his religions mixed up. There's Buddhists called, with Muslim names. And there's Thuggies who are Hindus with Muslim names. So it's all chaotic, but they make a great story. It's a cracking thriller and a cracking read. So hats off to him for doing these. But it is true that these are the stereotypes that people think. The Orient is a dark place with all these people who are either bandits or thugs or sacrificing animals in the dark, as the villagers did think. I mean, some of the reporters wrote that the reason they think that Edalji did these crimes is because his religion worships animal. They worship the sun and the moon, and they sacrifice nocturnal sacrifices to animals. Was the exact quote. So nothing of the sort. The Parsees do nothing of the sort. And of course, he wasn't even Parsees are Zoroastrians. He wasn't even a Zoroastrian anymore. He was he was Christian,
Yeah.
and he'd lived in this country all his life. He knew nothing about the Thuggy cult. But there we are. So these were the stereotypes. But I think the other reason is that Arthur Conan Doyle rises to this is that because he is a man of empire, he firmly believes in empire, and the thinking is that empire means justice, and the good side of empire. We give we stand for these values, and we give democracy, and we believe in justice, and this is where the justice has fallen through. So he feels, as a strong representative of the British Empire, that British justice has to be delivered. And I think that is why he really sort of jumps into this case. Of course, the other side is that he was going through a dark patch in his life at this time. He was very depressed. His wife had just died a few months back, and he was in love with Jean Leckie. He was conflicted because he felt the guilt that I am now free to marry Jean, and was I wishing for my wife to die, etc. So all these dark thoughts are coming into his mind, very much like Sherlock Holmes going through his moods, and Arthur Conan Doyle was going through these when this letter arrived. And he himself writes that it was a welcome distraction. It took him to another place, and suddenly there was something to fight for. Miscarriage of justice, champion the cause of somebody who is, out and sort of downtrodden, and it all worked for him. So it helped him as much as it helped Edalji. So I think. This sort of this is the sort of feeling that happened that appealed to Arthur Conan Doyle, and he jumped in. And once he jumped in, oh boy, did he really take it
He did. He
seriously.
did.
I mean, these letters, these archives in Portsmouth, if researchers want to go there and see them, you'll see that he is writing on his honeymoon. It's incredible. His poor wife, she's there on this honeymoon after waiting to marry him for years and years. Poor Jean. All he's doing is these letterhead, the hotel letterheads. He is writing to Anson day in and day out. There's letters from Venice, Dusseldorf. We know all the trail where he's gone on his honeymoon because we can see where, all the hotel letterheads. and he is obsessed with the case. So
I think the idea that he comes in because of this innate sense of injustice and desire to do something about it is really fascinating when you actually think back to some of those early works set in India or connected to India as well. I was just thinking about some of them earlier today in advance of the podcast, and I was struck by the fact that a lot of the time you have quite dodgy characters from England who have gone to India, who then get their just rewards, as in the form of killer Buddhists in the case of Mystery of Gloomba, but things like the Brown Hand, where somebody has actually stolen the hand of a man through an amputation, and he gets haunted by it until the hand is returned, and Sign of Four can be seen as that kind of things as well. So this whole notion of the revenge, and I just thought it's an interesting point because of the fact that there's that even in the most absurdist depictions of Anglo-Indian Gothic in early Conan Doyle, you still have this sort of revenge element to it, which is you reap what you sow, as it were.
Right. And also, I was reading Klumba today, this afternoon before. Thank you, Paul, for pointing that one out to me. And, there is the only mention, because I was always wondered how much he knew about Parsees. I knew he was interested in Buddhism and all the other Indian religions. So he thinks one of these three men, the three Buddhists, one of them is a Parsee. So he's got it totally wrong. I mean, but they think he's from Hyderabad. He's a merchant. He's a Parsee merchant from Hyderabad. So that was intriguing. But there's also this, which I found a parallel with Sign of Four, is that the Englishman has escaped back to England, has not escaped, but has come back, returned to England, and is guilty of something he's done there, and that's going to haunt him. This happens in both these stories, and of course, revenge in a horrific way is taken by the Indians. But there we are. That's this Gothic mystery that we get. It's a great story, but full of stereotypes.
Well, he gets his backgrounds come from things. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins is a huge influence on both those stories, and the Uncle Jeremy's Household is this sprawling Gothic novel, Confessions of a Thug, written in 1839 by Philip Meadows Taylor, who'd actually been an officer involved in hunting the thugs, but then he kind of fictionalized it all, and this becomes a hugely influential book. I mean, Queen Victoria herself is, it's only 2 years into her reign, and she's apparently asking for the run straight off the printing press. She's so desperate to finish this book. It's this hugely influential sort of the idea that it's then feeding the British public with of these kind of mysterious Oriental societies and so on, which is then being played upon in the literature, and then is obviously being regurgitated during the Edalji case. These stereotypes are fixed in the public imagination.
Absolutely. I mean, the two things that always run through these novels set at this time, the British Raj sort of novels, is the mutiny, of course, and Afghanistan. And we know that Arthur Conan Doyle is obsessed. I mean, Watson has come from, he's an Afghan veteran, and he's been there, Second Afghan War. So these two strains are always very strong. And of course, the fascination is, the Kohinoor is there. So the fascination with the with the bling and the diamonds, whether it's the Agra jewels or it's Moonstone, it's all influence of this glitter that lies in these Indian palaces and treasures. So it plays. It sort of it becomes the DNA of these plots.
And interestingly, with Doyle, I find when he's talking about India as well, it's two of the great sort of Indian mutiny background stories he has, is the Sign of the Four and the Crooked Man. Is the mutiny is used as a kind of Victorian British symbol of betrayal, is the way it was read. But it's interesting that the characters who actually are the betrayers in both those stories are corrupt Englishmen.
Yeah.
So Conan Doyle's he's being rather more sophisticated in his approach. And again, this you can see it in informing perhaps his view on George Edalji, and this is the underdog, and this man is being picked on by this rather corrupt, as Conan Doyle would see him,
Police
English
chief.
police officer with
Yeah,
Anson.
yeah, absolutely. And he compares it to the Dreyfus affair in France,
Mm.
which I found very interesting. Is so it also strikes you that does he want to be like Emile Zola?
Yes.
This is
Mm,
this is his J'accuse moment,
mm,
and he says that in France it happened with a Jew, the Dreyfus affair, and here it's happened with a Parsee. So he's very clear,
Mm.
and he says England was quick to condemn what happened in France.
mm,
But this is happening in our society right now. So he
mm.
really makes a case, very, very strong case, and forces the Home Office to act very reluctantly, but yeah, they do act.
And while we're on the topic of what Conan Doyle does in campaigning for George and for justice, he gets involved in this quite remarkable battle with Anson, which is really brought to the fore in the book. So tell us a bit about the background on Anson and this incredible dispute.
Right. So Anson, the great, he's called Captain Anson, but that is from his military background. He's George Augustus Anson, and he's an aristocrat. He's the son of the Earl of Lichfield. Huge estates. His ancestors have traveled the world, been part of the Admiralty, traveled to China. Victoria crosses in the mutiny. We always come back to the mutiny. So there's a strong India link always with most aristocratic landowning families anyway in England have a strong India link. Everyone's linked with the East India Company. So Anson has that link. And of course, being what he is, he's an imperialist to the core. He cannot stand Shapurji Edalji. He takes an instant dislike to him, and he tells Arthur Conan Doyle that he doesn't know why a Hindu vicar. He calls him the Hindu vicar. Of course, he's not Hindu at all. Hindu seem to be the generic name used just to describe all Indians. So he says that he doesn't know why the Hindu vicar who speaks faulty, English faultily, has been appointed as a vicar in an all-white parish. So has no sympathy for Shapurji. He's ready to believe every report that is sent by his police sergeant on the spot, who is totally prejudiced. And later we know that he's discharged on drunkenness. So his reports are not, absolutely not reliable. He never goes to the vicarage. The least he could have done is called on the
Mm.
vicarage. This is the vicar of Great Wyrley who is, in this picture being threatened with anonymous letters. He never calls it, and he's invited to come to the vicarage, but he never goes. So that just stands out as his extreme prejudice and his he just George, when the reports come about George, he is so ready to believe that a 17-year-old would do this absurd thing of stealing a key from a school that he doesn't go to and then plant it outside his house. It defies logic, but he's ready to believe the worst, and he says he's going to get penal, make sure that he is gets penal punishment for this. So uh, and the thing is, Arthur Conan Doyle sees through him straight away.
Mm.
He immediately knows that this is coming from deep prejudice, and he says it in his as much in his papers. And then this leads to a huge rivalry, because once the Home Office says that, gives George a free pardon but denies him compensation, that's when the real battle begins. So it's almost like part three of the book, because now Arthur Conan Doyle says this far he had only concentrated on saying that George was not guilty. Now he's going to prove who's the guilty party. And so he's going to investigate this further, take it a step up. And he's obviously dismissing the Staffordshire police as totally inefficient. So this really riles Anson, who says he's not going to be taught policing by a writer of crime fiction.
Mm.
And it becomes a huge ego clash.
Mm.
And by the end, this is several months of correspondence, which is delightful to read because they are just going at each other, hammer and tongs. Not so much ACD. Arthur Conan Doyle is actually being very polite, but slowly losing his patience. You can see that he is almost writing through gritted teeth. But Anson is just rude. He just dismisses every suggestion. He dismisses everything, throws every theory out. And then what's worse, I mean, I won't give away the whole plot, but what I learned is that through these archives is that he actually lays false trails for Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes.
This was amazing that this policeman has, instead of investigating the case, he is more concerned with discrediting Arthur Conan Doyle. So he lays this elaborate, he's wasting police money on laying an elaborate trap so he can just trip up Arthur Conan Doyle. And so it goes on and on till Arthur Conan Doyle finally sends him a solicitor's letter and says, that's it. You will not write to me anymore. Talk to me through my solicitor. But Anson goes on. He goes on and on and on about it.
I know we
Oh,
don't want to give away the
yeah.
the detail of it, but the entrapment is quite an amazing revelation in this.
It's shocking. Absolutely shocking.
And the detail, oh my God, it took me by complete surprise. So as I was reading this, I was going, the book is very much written on me on Conan Doyle's trail as he's going through this investigation. And I was discovering what he's discovering. And it was like up and down because there's just so many twists and turns the whole way. And also that Anson himself writes anonymous letters. He himself has sent in a letter to George Edalji. So it's a lot going on. And, Anson is at the heart of it. And of course, this clash between these two Victorian figures is also very entertaining.
This caught my eye in particular. Where we find out that, again, without giving too much away, is that one of the main suspects has relatives who are Freemasons. And I don't know, was Anson a Freemason? And it just feels like he's covering up and protecting people.
Yeah, no, Anson wasn't a Freemason.
Right.
Though Arthur Conan Doyle was, actually.
Yes.
So that is interesting. He wasn't, no, it wasn't that made him. It was just the need to oppose Arthur Conan Doyle. That is it. So he comes to, Royden Sharp, this person in question. He just comes to the aid of this family in a way he had never bothered with the, Edaljis and Shapurji. He's literally helping them along in every way, giving them advice, writing to the family, visiting the family, which he had never bothered to do. He never went to the vicarage, but he goes to this person's house. And so it is, I think, purely to prove Arthur Conan Doyle wrong, that he goes into it in such depth and finally does a bit of policing. But of course, laying long, sort of, I mean, everybody trips up in this at various stages. We won't give it away, but yes, but it is his need to, show up Arthur Conan Doyle and prove him wrong that sort of drives him.
It's this shocking idea of what was going on within the police that's always struck me with this case, is where it is presented as a straightforward miscarriage of justice, and to me it's even more than that. It is corruption going on here. There's the deliberate prejudice against the Edaljis and the twisting of it's quite appalling. It's not just Conan Doyle playing the detective. It's Conan Doyle, as we've just been talking about. His sense of justice is absolutely at the heart of this, and that this must be uncovered, and this wrong must be righted.
Yeah, and he exposes every bit. He is relentless, and he's forensic in just pointing out everything that the evidence that is brought to trial. He said this would never have been admitted in any court. It obviously went to the lowest court, and the police inefficiency, the way they gathered evidence, it was completely wrong. So at every stage, from the police to the courts, everything went against this family, and deliberately so, because initially they were not bothered. They were just fixated in their head that this man, this George Edalji, for no reason at all, has done this. Why would a solicitor who leads a really boring life, he does nothing, he has no friends, he's a loner, he goes to office, he meets his clients, he takes the same train every day, he goes to office, he comes back by the same evening train, he doesn't go to the pub, he doesn't drink, he's not like other people. He goes and meets more clients in the vicarage in the evenings, and he just goes for walks and spends time with his family. He lives in the vicarage, even when he's working. He hasn't moved out. He's born there. He lives there. So he's rather dull as a person in some ways, as others might see him. But of course, what reason would he have to go in the middle of the night and slash horses? He
Mm.
was not crazy. There was nothing in him that suggested this. So, but there they were. They believed that he had done it, and they would not be budged.
Mm.
And right till the end, Anson, he keeps saying he's the one who's done it, even after the pardon. He stands his case. Mm.
I think what I've probably learned most from your book on this as well is the fact that this is almost the interconnection of a number of cases. So you start with the early letters
Mhm,
from 1888, and then the dismissal of the maid, and then letters start again 3 years later, and then you've also got the animal attacks.
mhm,
It's a number of cases interconnected, and as well as the Edalji family, there seems to be an awful lot of the village are connected into this case in one way or another, which hasn't really been highlighted before
mhm.
in previous, certainly from students of Conan Doyle. This has never really been gone into before. It's absolutely fascinating to see how widespread
Mhm.
and mixed this case is.
Of course, because it starts, as I said, in 1888, and
Mm,
this goes on till in 1903, and then even after, it carries on. So it's all linked, and obviously the vicarage is targeted right from the start. And
mm,
then we don't know how what leads to what. The killing might have been totally unconnected, but the letters
mm,
start again
Mm.
immediately. So was it the same person doing both? Were they different people doing, all jumping in and writing these letters? So Anson does admit that a lot of people wrote the letters. He does say that later. But how many villagers were writing these letters?
mm,
Because it
mm,
is very local. It is definitely local. And this is a village with a small population. The police should have been able to nail this right from the start. It's just that they weren't
absolutely.
interested.
Mm,
And that's the one consistent fact, I think, across all of these related crimes is the reaction of the police.
Hmm.
um, and the main crime that comes out of this is small town racism. Really,
Hmm.
that's the main abiding feature of the case.
mm,
Um,
Hmm.
at some point I was sort of racking my brains going, okay, well, who actually was behind all of this? What was actually going on? Why
mm,
were they doing it? But in a way, it's a complete sideshow to what the story is, really. That's an incidental detail along the line.
Mm, it is, but one does wonder, and everybody, all of us, have our theories and
mm,
possibilities. So it's really interesting because in the archives there's a letter by Shapurji Edalji, or it's one of the police records that he goes to the police station, and when they ask him, do you have anybody you suspect, and he actually makes a big long list of
Mm.
people he thinks could have done it, and the police do nothing about it. They just toss it away. So he did think of people, whether they were, involved in any way or not, we don't know. But at least they could have followed up some of the leads. It's
mm.
very clear that the police followed no leads. They did absolutely nothing. They just sat on their hands, and then when they could, they just arrested Edalji. That's it.
Mm.
I mean, I found, I think you've mentioned this before in talks. I mean, the timing of the first letters is very interesting, with it being at the time of the Jack the Ripper case in London,
Mhm.
where obviously that a lot of fake letters and so on were involved there. And you just wonder, did the original letter writer get their idea? Were they inspired by this?
Mhm.
Whether it be the maid or whoever, it just seems a coincidence of timing.
And the press referred to, the killer as the Whirly Ripper,
Mm, mm,
because this happened shortly after, a few years back, was the Jack the Ripper case, an unsolved crime, and there were letters there. But what the police files actually comment is that why were these written? The Jack the Ripper letters were different, whereas
mm,
the letters here were slightly different because they are written in the name of George Edalji,
mm,
and also in the name of some certain other villages. So there's sort of pseudonymous and anonymous.
mm,
But why would why would George? sort of, blame himself, say, I'm the killer, and write it. It made no sense. If it was somebody, if he really was crazy, there could be anonymous letters saying George did it, and that was more likely. But why have it written in the name of a schoolboy and then say he did it? So it was all very complicated. The nature of the letters, and also they were probably, I don't think there was just one letter writer. I think there were a few, and they all just got into it because, this is one way of harassing this family, and they just did it. It's the letters they're quite hard to read because not only are they racist, they are, some of them are bordering, maniacal letters, and you just wonder, it's constantly kill, kill, kill. It's like, how would you feel when you received letters like this saying we're going to kill you? Your son will be in his grave in a few, by the time this is over. Letters on those lines, but. Anyway, so I think there were a few people involved in writing these.
And I did enjoy the moments of Conan Doyle doing his best Sherlock Holmes attempt at interpreting the letters and saying, well, it doesn't quite go so far as to say, it's a left-handed individual, etc., etc. But he does do quite a lot of psychological analysis on people writing it and comes up with some quite shocking, descriptions.
He does, and he also gets them analyzed by independent experts. So he gets it analyzed by the person who did the letters in the Dreyfus affair. So he really takes it to the highest level. He gets George's eyesight tested by independent opticians, so that it's not like he's saying it. It's all independent opticians, independent. It's like what you do now, fact checking.
Yes.
It was what he was doing. It was the equivalent of what he was doing. He sent it off to handwriting experts in France. He got those letters back. He sent them to the Home Office. Did they care? No. So he was really doing so much groundwork. It was amazing that, one man, he interviewed so many people. It was a really thorough job that he did over months and months. So very impressive.
So it's interesting just to maybe reflect a bit on Conan Doyle himself, and what's your take on him, having lived in his letters and his exchanges with Anson over the last few months writing the book? What's your takeaway? How do you see Conan Doyle?
Well, it was amazing the way the spirit with which he took up this campaign. To me, that was really, really interesting to see, see unfolding before my eyes as I read all those letters, see the extent and the detail into which he went, and you could just see how his brain worked, it gives you an insight into how he actually wrote his, famous novels, because the thinking and the analysis that is going into this is something that he's doing there, very much there. Of course, that's all fiction. This is the world of reality. So how much does he, where it's facts, how much is he going to, sort of fall short? That was also interesting to watch. So he comes up with flying colors. And it's really endearing, the relationship that he has with George, because when he invites him for his wedding, and he writes in his memoirs that there was no other guest that he was the guest I was the most proud of. So that's really nice. And you can just visualize this awkward figure of George Edalji standing in a corner, not able to talk to all these writers there, Bram Stoker, the who's who of the literary world, all sort of in this reception, drinking champagne and eating caviar, and there he is probably in a corner watching them all, awkwardly gives a present, and so it's really endearing to see that he invited him, he was proud of him, and he remained his friend. They remained in touch, and he was proud of him right through.
There's a lovely coda to that. In 1951, when as part of the Festival of Britain, there was the Sherlock Holmes exhibition at Baker Street, and it was visited, I think, more than once by George Edalji and his sister Maud were both spotted there, and so he kept this interest, and was obviously proud of his association with Conan Doyle.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that you were always looking for is that did this case finally then end up in one of Arthur Conan Doyle's books? But I don't think it did. We don't. I mean, I don't know if there was some form of it somewhere, but not really likely. I think he kept it as the case that he investigated, because there was another case that he does get into, and that's the case of Oscar Slater. But he doesn't investigate that himself. He just looks at the evidence and he writes that this is a miscarriage of justice. So it's very different. And then he didn't like Oscar Slater. He paid for his defense. And then when Oscar Slater, when he got compensation, he asked him to return the money to all those who had sort of contributed to it. And Oscar Slater says no, and then he just walks off, and he never talks to him again. And that's the difference with Edalji, because when he raises funds for the Edalji campaign, and he asks George if he'd like that, because George had no work, he had no income. George says no. So again, that is noted by Arthur Conan Doyle, and he says, see this boy, he's a respectable, genuine boy. He didn't take the money that was raised. He said, give it to my aunt, who sort of gave the money, but he himself didn't take any of it. So that earned, his respect for him. That earned his respect with Arthur Conan Doyle. So it was a good relationship, which is very endearing.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think we're getting close to time. I was just going to ask you a final question, if I may, which is, what's next for you, Shrabani? Now that you've done The Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer, are you working on, what can we expect coming from you soon?
Well, it's been a hard time writing this because of the lockdown and everything that all of us have been through. And so I'm not going to rush into the next, but I've been sitting and actually reading a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle's that I haven't read so far and really enjoying them, because, he wrote so much. It's impossible to have read them all, but it's lovely. And thank you, Paul, for pointing out 2 more to me, because it's such a treat to read these, pull them out and just read them. So I'm enjoying that a lot. And something will turn up, but I'm not rushing into anything right now.
Whatever it is, I'm sure it will be as delightful as all your other books. So we just want to thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Yes,
and best of luck with the book and the promotion. And we hope to speak to you again at a future date.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was a great discussion, and I'm sure we could have gone on an awful lot longer with Shrabani. What were your big takeaways from having read the book recently, Paul?
Well, my take is really how much more complex a case this is than I'd actually realised, or has been discussed in a lot of, certainly in a lot of Doyle's biographies. The sheer level of that, it's a number of different cases with the first run of letters, and then a second run, and then the letters combined with the animal mutilations. All these cases are going on at the same time, and also how widespread it's amongst the local area. This seems to have been, this letter writing, and how many of the villagers were involved in one way or another. And the other thing that comes out of it is there's always been this idea of the miscarriage of justice and police incompetence. But you really get from this a level of police intransigence and almost corruption. That comes from Shrabani having studied these letters from Anson.
Yes, and for me, I think what Shrabani has really done with this book is to reset the frame around the Edalji case. And we now know it's pronounced Edalji as a result of a letter that George wrote that's included in Shrabani's book. Because I think the frame around this previously has been Conan Doyle's investigation and the defense of the Edalji family and of George specifically. But actually what really comes out of this is the deep-set racism and the persecution of the Edalji family, who come out of this with much more agency than I've seen in other accounts. And it feels an incredibly topical and relevant book. We live in a time where racism is never far from the headlines and is the reality for a great number of people. And the book has lessons in there that are just as relevant to us today as they were for the poor Edalji family, over 100 years ago. So next time we return to our regular programming and we touch on a story that we mentioned with Shrabani earlier today.
Yes, you'll have heard Uncle Jeremy's Household mentioned a few times, which is an 1887 Indian Gothic story, which Conan Doyle published in the Boy's Own paper. So we will be discussing that in depth in the next episode.
Excellent. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.